everyone. My name is Deanna Wolf and I'm with Tree Fundraising. Welcome to our question and answer live program today. I am speaking with Amsel Page von Spreckelsen, sorry about that. And we're going to be talking about all things charity finance. So we are broadcasting on our Tree Fundraising site on Twitter. It's a trust fundraising site on Twitter, and it's on LinkedIn as well as on Trust Fundraising Hub. So we've got some questions. We didn't get very many questions asked today, so I've gone through and asked a bunch of them myself. If you are looking for anything, feel free to mention our post below in the comments, and we'll hopefully be able to catch them. But in the meantime, Amsel is BCF Consulting, and they are a specialist in charity finance, governance, and resilience. They've made a career based on making financial information accessible to users within charitable organizations, demystifying budgets, and increasing confidence. So hopefully we'll be able to do some of that today. Our next, just so if you're taking notes, our next session is going to be on July 21st at 12:15 again, and it will be on all 3 platforms. So I'm going to start with a nice juicy one on reserves, because that seems to be the talk of the day in and around the websites as well as at the Scottish Conference this past week. What considerations should be used when you're determining the very best, the best level of reserves for an individual charity?
So this is one, and in our preamble, we had a little bit of a chat about this, because the standard thing that a lot of charities use is that kind of winding down costs, or 3 months to, it almost feels like, you've got 3 months of your charity. How much does it cost to run that? How much does that work? And that should be your starting point. It's a nice, simple starting point. It makes sense. It's easy to understand. Actually, it's quite a useful starting point, because it forces you as a finance person or as a CEO or whatever sort of charity leader to actually really look at your organisation and go, how much does it cost us to run? What is what is absolutely essential, what isn't, what's our liabilities in terms of kind of redundancy costs, in terms of rents and things that we might have to pay even if we're not trading or even if we're not doing anything. So it's a really important figure to have in the background. It's really important figure to have kind of underpinning some of your decision making. And there is an element to which that should be your minimum. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it should be your actual reserve. It should be what you base your reserve figure on. And what you base your reserve figure on is entirely up to you and what your charity does. And so it becomes a little bit, everyone wants an answer. Everyone wants a straightforward answer, which is often why people say 3 months. Because if someone keeps pestering you and says, no, but what do you really think? You end up having to say 3 months, fine. But actually, you should be thinking of your reserve in the way that a sort of commercial business might think of its working capital. It's the cushion. It's your contingency funding. So rather than building your contingency funding into your budgets and inflating your budgets, if you can get your budgets a lot leaner, and so that they're actually about what you're really spending rather than what you think you might have to spend if something goes wrong, then your reserve becomes that bubble. You then have to obviously let funders and that know that that's what you're doing with that reserve. But I think that's a really useful way to do it, because then that gives your management team the ability to start doing decisions on, are we running a deficit budget this year? Because we need to run, because our reserves have got too high, because we had too much contingency, so we're going to run them down. Or are we running a deficit budget because we've seen a real need and we put a bunch of reserves in case that need came up, and they're not designated, they're not necessarily there. We could have chosen to do something else with them. They're not, we didn't just put them there on this one thing. We had a sort of, it makes that much more flexible decision making, essentially. And then when you've got less to do for a particular year and you've got money coming in, if you have a reserve policy that allows you to bring that unrestricted funding into that reserve, and you've got that history that says you're making clever, important decisions about that reserve rather than just sitting on it, that becomes a sort of much more working reserve management target rather than just a straightforward, this is the fixed figure that we have to be at, and we don't think about it anymore.
Okay.
Anything to add on that?
It was always for me. It was always minimum what you needed for closing down, and that included not just your redundancy payments, included all of the other costs that were included. And sometimes it's not 3 months that you need to do. I worked for one organization that was a health and care organization. They figured they would need 2 years to close down properly because they provided a singular service that required hospital beds, and they wouldn't be able to find those hospital beds enough at a quality that could deliver the appropriate care, even the minimum level of care across Scotland. And so it was 2 years for them.
Yeah, and that's a really sensible decision because, and it's really defensible as well, because if someone says, well, why is reserve so high? You say, well, because our responsibility is those people in those beds.
Yeah, exactly. Which comes to the process of designating. So when you've got those extra ones and you've got those little bits and pieces, I've recently done an application where they wanted to know the free reserves, and the free reserves weren't huge, but for this organization, they were actually quite large because it had their winding down fees, which they wanted to keep very clear, and they had policies within their board that if they reached into if they got into that amount of money, then that would mean that it would trigger winding down if they got to there. But they had other money, except that the other money was also their sort of current account and their rainy day account and we're building and saving up because next year we want to do this really big thing and we need this extra money. And it was their general reserves for anything else and for keeping them going. So how easy is it to designate? That's what we've been trying to do in their accounts, is designate.
Yeah. So on a practical level, designation is as easy as writing a note in the accounts. You know, you literally just go, right, I'm going to designate this figure. I mean, that's a very cheap answer. Because obviously it's more complicated than that, and you have to be able to prove that the designation is correct. And I'd actually, interestingly, you're talking about this organisation having almost a clause that says if you break down the winding down costs, if you enter the winding down costs, then you immediately start winding down. That to me feels like actually quite a dangerous clause to have within your organisation. Because, and I'd have to look into this, I don't think you actually can designate a specific amount of money for something that is only, so primarily what you have to designate something for is it has to have a sort of realistic chance of happening, and a realistic reason for being there. So a lot of this stuff comes down to interpretation, and it'll be that conversation that you have with your auditors around, is this reasonable? Is this the sort of thing that we can do? And you, for example, you can't, even if you plan, this came up in a forum that I'm in, a treasurer's forum that I'm in recently, where someone was talking about an organisation that wanted to, they knew they were going to have a new member of staff for next year, so they wanted to designate funds that were currently in their reserves to that new member of staff. But everyone was saying, well, you can't do that because, one, you haven't actually made the decision yet about the member of staff, and two, that it looks like you're trying to hide reserves, because actually it's just ordinary operating costs, and a new member of staff is an ordinary operating cost. On the other hand, you don't want to end up in a sort of position where so we're working in NHS charities for a while. I once talked to someone whose trust they were charging a management fee to each fund every year for for just having it in existence, which meant that this particular fund that, you know, had been given and then over a number of years, to create a diabetes centre, and over a number of years, whilst that was happening, by the time they got down to it, that fund didn't exist anymore because it had been chipped away by management. That was also wrong, and I did tell them to go back to their finance team and tell them that it was wrong and to give the money back, because it was a ridiculous thing. But it's again, that's the sort of thing where they could have designated funds. I mean, it was restricted, so they didn't have to, but they would have been able to designate that fund because they're building them. You know, they've gone, right, we've decided that we're going to be producing, you know, we're going to be doing a big capital project. We've got the money set aside for it. So it's a lot about that negotiation between you and your auditors and you and your management team, and what the purpose of the designation is. So if the purpose of the designation is very clearly because you want to reduce the amount that you're showing in unrestricted reserves, people are going to say, well, no, you can't do that. Just put it in unrestricted reserves and put a note in the account that says we ran an excess budget this year because we're planning on spending it next year.
I think what it is some of the application forms on trusts and foundations, they just want the number. What's your free reserves? So I think it's having that designation of this is how much money we have free that we can play with, and having it so that number is an accurate portrayal, especially when they don't want you to send your accounts to them, so you don't have that space to explain. Which is frustrating from a trust point, from a fundraising point of view. Understandable that they don't want too much information from the thousands of applications that they're getting in from to the funders. But there's got to be a happy ground that we can find.
Absolutely, it's a really weird thing. I think there's one of the things I've discovered over my many years of working in the charity sector is how little or how divergent the not just the goals, but the way in which we're regulated. So the difference between what finance teams are doing and what fundraising teams are doing. And on the surface, they should be working together, and we really have to work together. This is one of the earliest things I learned was get to know the fundraisers in your organisation, because they're the people who you need to have that constant conversation with. Because you're doing stuff like that, because I'm in a position where I can't designate something. You're in a position where you have to designate it. How do we square that circle? And there are usually ways of doing it that remain safe and legal. But it is about retaining that conversation and making sure that you know exactly what you're putting into a particular fund and why, or a particular application and why.
To take on from there, it's part of another question that we discussed earlier, but prior to coming online. But how to tackle interdepartmental relationships with finance, because I know I've had some really interesting conversations with my finance teams, and sometimes we work amazingly well together, and they really understand what I'm trying to do as a trust fundraiser and how much detail and how far ahead I need to be. And some of them think that I'm the devil incarnate, and the red hair doesn't help.
It's an interesting one. Finance, and this is I'm not saying this to be so kind of oh me oh my, but finance as a function, especially within charity, is often underfunded and overworked. So if you come to us asking for what's happening next month, we're usually going, I don't even know what happened last month, and I have to put it all at, so the problem is, organisationally, if that's not understood and if that's not accounted for, then you end up with these sorts of silos and stuff. And it doesn't help by the fact that often, especially in an office environment, finance teams usually have to be behind a locked door, and that's for very good reason, because we live in an office where we have to have access to people, all sorts of information that has to be locked away. Doesn't necessarily mean that what happens is then we end up sitting behind that locked door and not ever coming out. So what I would always say to finance teams is come out from behind your door, you know, go to lunch with people, get to know people, talk to people. What I say to the senior management teams is really, really stop putting finance in far away, hard to reach places. I once worked for an NHS hospital trust where we were behind the finance team, or one part of the finance team was behind 2 locked doors on the top floor of a hospital building that wasn't owned by the trust that we worked for. It was owned by a neighbouring trust that we were renting stuff. So no one. How do you have that conversation?
Especially when for trust fundraisers, we're not supposed to leave the office.
Yeah. So you need to have that organisational structure that allows for people to be one. You know, whether if it's office work or you know, allows for that physical wandering around. If it's remote, allows for people to have those kind of conversations and not necessarily be at their desk on, you know, because finance people are often told, oh, well, you shouldn't be leaving the office. You have to sit there and you have to process and you have to stamp your thing. And that's where you start to see, because ultimately, obviously, you're all doing the same job. You're all trying to get your charity in the best place financially. But as we said just now, you often have different not motivations, but different pressures that you're under. And by having that conversation, then you can start doing things. So a lot of the time, trust fundraisers have to produce reports that are very specific, very tied to a particular trusts.
And exceptionally detailed, down to the pence.
So as a fundraiser, you often end up, I've met a lot of trust fundraisers who run their own set of accounts. But that tends to diverge from what's in the normal accounts, because the finance team makes changes and does things, and they often do it off their own backs because they know where, you know, they have a particular reason why something needs to be somewhere, and they don't tell you. Except everything that's in the finance system, it's often very easy to add flags or to add notes or to add something, or even just to put into Excel and put it out again, that gives you what you need as a trust fundraiser really easily. I remember doing that for a friend of mine who now works as a trust fundraiser, a guy called Dave Burgess. We used to work together at the same organisation, and I remember him once kind of having to do some kind of Arts Council reporting, and he sent me this spreadsheet, and I was like, what have you been doing, Dave? And I'm like, I've been putting that's my job. I can do this. I've got it here for you. It's yours. But there needs to be that space within both teams' workloads to have that not downtime, but to have that conversation time rather than being forced to just churn out stuff. So from your side of view as a fundraisers out there, get to know your finance people and understand the pressure that they're under, which is often to just create, to get stuff into the finance system yesterday.
I found that with the ones I've worked with, that where everything worked really well, I gave them lots of notice. I said, what kind of reminders do you want from me? And these are the reports that I have to fill in, so they understood. And these are the terms and conditions that we've signed. And I always add in slightly as a threat, because it's true. If we don't get this reporting in, we don't either get the next tranche of money, or we have to give it back.
Yeah.
And when we have to give it back is attached to 6-figure gifts, all of a sudden people go, oh, okay. And it's like, right, so how can we make this happen together? So I think there's always going to be personality conflicts, but it's about trying to work through it and just get it in there and make sure everyone understands where things are coming from.
And the thing is, you view that as a threat, almost, that kind of, we have to do this. Whereas I, as a finance professional, view that as really useful information that I didn't have before. And again, personality clash you can't help, but most people doing my kind of job, we're not dispassionate, but we are looking at those sorts of things. We're trying to, we've got a big pile of things that we have to do, and we're trying to put them in order of what are the things that if I don't do them, everything falls down? So if you tell us something is going to go wrong, we will put it to the top of our pile. You know, and that's really important information for us, actually.
Mm-hmm. I always thought so. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to pick and choose some of the questions that I've got. One of the things that is also coming up is we're now in recession, I believe. I don't want to believe it, but I have to. On the other hand, I've also lived through a lot of recessions, so I know that we will at some point come out the other side. And I think we all have to keep remembering that we will come out the other side. But good practice and best practice will, to a certain extent, get us through to the other side on that. But over the next 6 months or 12 months, which we're starting to apply for funding for now, if not immediate things as well, how can trust fundraisers start planning for budget changes like inflation going up incredibly, or you know, the cost of materials, either because of Brexit or worldwide transportation issues, if you're on a capital project or anything else, everything is going up. Salaries are going, some salaries for new jobs are going up, cost of living is going up. We used to do 3% a year for year-on-year budgets because that would kind of give you wiggle room. But what can people do now? Because it's kind of all over the place.
Yeah. And I think, again, it comes back to that creating that relationship with your finance team. And then in the senior level, making sure that your kind of senior fundraising team is talking to your senior finance person so that they are getting that. They're getting that information, getting sight of where, because, you know, unsurprisingly, a lot of finance teams and a lot of financial planning teams, you know, like the sort of higher level management, don't want to kind of tell everyone what's going on in terms of we're expecting to have this cost of living increase or that, you know, or that pay rise or whatever, because you know, you're doing modeling on stuff and it might not work out, and then people get frustrated or they get, you know, there's a balancing act there. But even if they're not telling the wider team, even if your senior fundraiser isn't able to give the full picture, they should have the full picture. They should know what's going on. They should be on the same level as that financial manager and have that same level of information. In terms of then doing those bids and how you plan for it, I think one of the really important things is to create that relationship. Especially if you're doing those longer sort of 3-year type bids or 5-year type bids, which so if you're doing like a sort of 1 year or a sort of a fixed sum thing, you just go for as much money as you can and let the finance manager and people who are paid to worry about whether or not it's going to cover everything, worry about that. But when we're talking about these 3-year type bids where you have to actually have a lot of kind of control, a lot of feedback, because if you agree with an organisation, with a trust that they're going to fund 3 years worth of activity, and then in year 2 that activity cost spikes by 50%, but you only put 3% down. I mean, hopefully it won't be 50%, but you know that if that trust then says, oh well, we're not going to do it because it's your fault, or we're going to renege or anything, or we're just going to completely cancel because you failed on these particular things, that's obviously a really important thing that you need to be aware of. But you can't plan for that, because who knows? Even the best planners out there don't know what's going to happen. So it's about ensuring that conversation with you have that relationship with that trust that says, this budget that I've created is a snapshot. It's a snapshot of our thinking, our understanding of the world at the point at which we made it. Mm-hmm. And you talk to them and say, you know, yes, we might need to have, and this comes back to where your reserves are in. So if your reserves, what you probably want to be doing at this point, especially with going into this possible recession, is starting to look for as much of that unrestricted reserve as you can. You fatten up that reserve that says, we're allowed to, we can pull that down. So then you say to your funders, your trust funders, so this is what we think is going to happen. We're going to keep you updated as things change. We have a reserve so that we've got flex, so that if it goes too high, we can pull that reserve down. We can use that unrestricted funding to pull that in. But you have to understand that the fact that we have that reserve is not an excuse for you to not fund us now, because, you could do it with just your reserves. Why do you need us to do it? That reserve is to enable us to do it in this unstable situation. You are funding the work. We are giving you, by looking after reserves properly and securely, we are giving you the security that this work will happen, and you won't have to spend more on it, even if the world goes to hell in a handcart. And that's what happened during COVID. A lot of the really well run charities ran deficit budgets. They ran down their reserves, and they were able to do so and able to continue to support their thing because the rest of their funders understood why they had those high reserves and what they did.
Reserves are for the icing and the funders are for the cake.
Yeah. And sometimes you have to have a bit more icing because the cake sort of deflated in the oven because you forgot to put baking powder in.
I know. All of my metaphors come back to food. We've got just a few more minutes left, and I want to come ask something. You've responded to a question about this on one of the Facebook pages, and I'm not naming names, but when you've got, how can trust fundraisers decide when a deal is too good to be true? In the sense that when there's numbers and promises made about returns, and what are the kinds of things what are the kinds of things that you should be looking for as red flags for trust fundraisers? Because we'll get asked to recommend, is this a good idea?
So I've got a lot of thoughts about this. I think probably the biggest thing is to remember that not everyone is working from the same playbook that you are. So often in the charity sector, and this is a wider question about charity fraud, and one of the reasons charity actually has a lot of fraud happening in it, and one of the reasons it happens is because a lot of people in the sector believe that charity is immune to fraud. So we go into situations without even that most basic level of, is this person out to do me over? Because we would hope that they won't be. But the problem is they are. So when we look at something, and this isn't a kind of, sort of trust no one type situation, but it's more just go in with the same mindset that you would anywhere else. If someone's offering something that has, like a load of, it feels like they're pushing it. It's the old, if the person is coming around with a load of fish off the back of the lorry, and they're showing you the polystyrene cases, but they're not showing you inside one. They're only showing you inside the top one. What's in all the ones at the bottom. We want to believe that this person has our best interest in heart because we want to believe that people are good. But not everyone is. So it's just bring that same level of understanding and that same level of interrogation that you would to anything else. Do check websites. It's difficult because I know, I'm a freelancer, my website's crap because it's not actually how I get my work. Most of my work is through word of mouth and is through direct relationships with people, and my website exists just so that when people know that find out about me, they can see that I'm a real person. But that is a problem. You find a lot of freelancers' websites are rubbish, and what that means is that when you've got someone who's actually isn't legit, they'll blend in to all the other rubbish websites because none of us have the time to do it. So what you're looking for is whether that rubbishness is because of someone being genuinely it's not their job to write website copy, and they're trying their best, but actually they're an accountant or they're a fundraiser or whatever, or whether it's because they're rubbish. It's rubbish because it's full of fake Trustpilot reviews and, you know, flashy stuff that says you won't have anything to worry about us. Don't listen, don't think, that kind of, you know.
So try and get real references from people you know, and do things like the various people have been putting on Facebook lately, which is, and other media streams, which is, hi, have you heard of them? PM me. Any of the, and keep in mind, everyone, that if you're doing this, that what you put down, you're going to have to back up, or you could be legally responsible for it. So get in touch with people who have found similar situations or worked with them in the past.
Yeah. And the PM's a good answer for that because of that.
Most definitely. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I could talk about this forever because I think we've got some really great ones. Some of the questions I had were about how do you go about setting up due diligence and looking into your trust fundraisers or other trusts and foundations, and how do you interpret the accounts? And I think it just comes down to start reading lots of accounts and start familiarizing yourself with the content. And if you don't know what a balance sheet does, there's lots of first-year university courses and other courses that tell you what a balance sheet is and how it runs. So there's lots of information out there. If anyone has any other questions, do put them into Trust Fundraising Hub, onto the Money Tree fundraising site on LinkedIn, or onto the Twitter's Trust Fundraising Hub. And I'm sure people will answer questions. I know Amsel's on there answering questions. We do try and make sure that happens. So.
And if you've got any other questions, if you don't mind, so me and some other finance freelancer friends are doing we've got a bunch of sessions on small charity finance happening for Small Charity Week. So if you go to the Small Charity Week website, they're all free. They're on all sorts of different things. There is a Q&A session. It's a bunch of people who really know their stuff and me. So
that's great. That's great. And I really do recommend getting involved in Small Charities Week if you are a small charity. And if you're a new fundraiser, Small Charities Week actually brings it down to a really clear level as well. I'd like to thank you very much. And I'd like to thank everybody who's been listening or who will be watching our recordings in the future. Just to remind you, our next Q&A is at 12:15 again on July 21st. It's always the third Thursday of the month from 12:13 to 12:45, although we've stretched a bit. And all of our live recorded video or recordings are on our YouTube channel. So if you just go to YouTube and look up Money Tree Fundraising, you'll find them there. So if there's something you want to rewatch with this, we'll have it on our various streaming channels today. And then as you go along, they'll be on the Money Tree Fundraising YouTube. So Amsel, thank you so much. It's been great speaking with you. I'm going to buy you a coffee at one point and we can sit down and go through all the rest of the questions because I want those answers myself. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a lovely afternoon.